Hi, everyone. It's Miss Sheehan, and today I'm going to do a lecture on immigration during the Gilded Age and the Industrial Revolution. So please go ahead and take notes on this. It's fairly short, should be pretty easy. Okay, let's get into it. So first, a couple definitions. So the word immigrate with an I versus the word emigrate with an E. And so when we're talking about this period, we're talking about people generally coming to the United States. So that's immigrating with an I, right? Because we're talking about them moving into a new country. Whereas emigrate would be like, for example, you were going to move to Germany. So you would be talking about how you were going to emigrate with an E, right? But we're talking about people coming to the United States, so we're talking about it with an I. Okay. All right, so there were a few different waves of immigration during this period. The first wave was from the mid to late 1800s, so kind of the 1850s-ish to the 1880s. And this consisted of about 10 million immigrants, mostly European and Chinese immigrants primarily. So Europeans coming generally to the East Coast, Chinese people coming across the Pacific to the West Coast. And then we have the second wave of immigration, which is in the early 1900s, really before World War I. So about, 1890 to about 1914. That's the second wave of immigration. And that consists of a continuing migration of Europeans, but we also see a big migration of Russian Jewish people because of rising anti-Jewish sentiment in Russia. We also get more Eastern European people, so like Ukraine, Poland, etc., and then Asian people, so not just Chinese, but also Japanese, Indian, Indonesian, Filipino, etc., right? So basically immigration is spreading across the world. Okay, so in these years of the Industrial Revolution, from the end of the Civil War to the end of World War I, 1865 to 1920, almost 30 million people immigrate to the United States, which, if you think about it, right, during the Civil War, the population of the US was 30 million people, right? So the population doubles in immigration alone, not to mention the birth rate, et cetera. So this is a huge, huge number of people immigrating and coming to the United States. So New York City was kind of a hub for immigration. So we often bring it up as an example. So by 1900, New York City had more Irish residents than Dublin in Ireland, more Italians than any city except for Rome, including cities in Italy, more Jewish people than any city in the world. Right. And that's where like a lot of these neighborhoods that still exist in New York City come from, was from these immigrants moving to United States and New York City. And so really New York City is an example of how many people are coming to the United States when they, in just one city alone, outnumber cities in their own countries of origin. Okay, so go ahead and in your notes, make this little T-chart, please. Okay, so we're going to look at what are called pull factors, why people are coming to the United States, and push factors, why people are leaving their homes, right? So immigration with an I, why they come here, and emigrate with an E, why they're leaving the place they're from. Okay, so make that little T-chart, and then we're going to fill it out. Okay, so some push factors why they're leaving the places that they were originally from are population growth, right? There's a limited amount of land in many places, right? Especially some of the smaller European countries, right? And so they have to leave to make room. Hunger, there were several famines across Europe and China during this point. And land shortages, right? Especially in countries that had a long history, right? Like China, like England, right? Land was often already divided up. So if you wanted to own land and you weren't born into a family that traditionally held land, right? There was very little chance that you would be able to own and work your land. And religious persecution, particularly of Jewish people, but also Catholics as well. Okay, so some pull factors, reasons why people were coming to America. So why out of all the places in the world were people coming to America? So America offered a free and democratic society, one of a few at the time. Lots of farmland, right? America has this huge swath of farmland in the Midwest, in the middle of the country, and in the West Coast, where it's just, empty. And by empty, we mean obviously indigenous people were living there, right? But it hadn't been apportioned out to white people yet, right? And so there was a lot of land available. And jobs, right? Industrialization sees a huge increase in the number of jobs available for people. And so people in other places where industrialization was not the same, way as it was in the US, right, begin to come to America to look for work. And positive stories from previous immigrants, right? Which is why this immigration continued really over this 50-year period, right? So as immigrants come to the US and have a positive experience and find jobs and find land, right, and are successful, they say, hey, come to the US and you can experience what I did as well, right? So it kind of builds on each other. Oop, why aren't we? Sorry, I don't know why that's not working. Okay, so sorry about that. Okay, so here is a graph of immigration from the 1860s, the Civil War, to about the 1980s, right? So you can see during this during this late 1800 and early 1900 period, we have this huge influx of immigrants, right? And you can see that the dips are because of some of these economic panics, which is what this is referring to, the Panic of 1873, Panic of 1893 are economic recessions, right? And you can see, especially as the US starts to become this major industrial power in the late 1800s, early 1900s, we have this huge spike in immigration, which drops quickly off due to World War I when people are not really able to immigrate, and then quickly spikes again. And then what we'll talk about later this week is the application of immigration quotas, which is basically where the US government said, okay, we're going to limit immigration from certain places, right? And primarily, immigration is limited from places where people are not white, right? So China, Asia, Africa, etc. Immigration is still limited for white European countries as well, but not in the same way that it is for non-white countries, non-European countries, right? And then we have a slow rise over the 20th century, right? Okay. So here's a breakdown of who was coming to the United States. So by far the biggest portion was immigrants from Northern and Central Europe, right? So Germany, France, Switzerland, right? Poland, Ukraine, etc. Then our other chunk is Southern and Eastern Europe, Russia, Italy, right? Places like that, Romania, Bulgaria, 32%. Then we have this small chunk here is the Americas. So that's anywhere outside of the US that's still in North or South or Central America. And then a very small percentage, about 2% are from Asia, right? And then just very extremely small percentages, 0.2% from Oceania, which is Australia, right? And Africa, only about 0.1% of immigrants are from Africa at this point, right? So 75-ish% of immigrants during this time period are from Europe, right? So go ahead and copy this sentence into your notes and just fill it in with a couple of the percentages, just so you remember. Okay, so there were two major ports for immigration, one on each coast. Probably the most famous one is Ellis Island, which was in New York City. It's in the harbor of New York City. And this was the port of entry for most Western European and Central European immigrants. It was open for about 20 years, and over those 20 years, 12 million people passed through Ellis Island. So if your family immigrated from Europe during this time period, from England, Ireland, France, Germany, etc., there's a high likelihood that they went through Ellis Island. For example, like my genealogy, I've researched my father's family, the Sheehans, and there is records of a William Sheehan coming through Ellis Island and being recorded there. And he's my great-great-grandfather, right? So this is very common amongst people who have Western and Central European heritage, right? Overall, at Ellis Island, basically people get off the ships from Europe. They would be medically inspected, make sure they're not, carrying diseases, and then they would have legal interviews. And there wasn't, I think today we have a very different conception of what immigration looks like. You have to go through a process, right? You have to pay, you have to find a lawyer, you have to get visas, you have to be sponsored, etc. There was not the same kind of legal immigration that there was. You pretty much could just show up, and if you were white, right, and European, unless you were like an active criminal, you pretty much were getting in. Only 2% of the people who came through Ellis Island were deported, which means returned back to the country they came from. And that was primarily due to medical reasons, and then occasionally being a criminal reasons as well. But it was very rare if you were white and came through Ellis Island that you would actually be turned away. The other port of entry was on the west coast, Angel Island, which is in the harbor of San Francisco Bay, right? And this was open a little bit later than Ellis Island. It was open from 1910 until World War II in 1940. And this was the port of entry for most Asian and Russian immigrants, right? So Russians, because the country is so big, some of them came over the Atlantic, some of them came over the Pacific. But primarily Chinese and Japanese and Korean people came through Angel Island, right? And unlike Ellis Island, in the interviews and bar for entering the United States was much higher. And this was primarily because the people who came through Angel Island were not white. And as we'll look at later this week and next week, right, there were much stricter rules for non-white people who wanted to enter the US, right? Whereas Europeans, it was like pretty much show up and you'll be accepted, right? For a lot of Chinese especially, but as well as Japanese, Korean, Vietnamese, and other Asian people, right? There was a much higher chance that you would not be allowed to come into the United States. And in fact, 10% of people who came through Angel Island were deported back to their country of origin. And in fact, and one of the great tragedies of Angel Island is that people were detained there for years sometimes. They were just kept in detention centers on this island in the middle of San Francisco Bay, right? Basically as a way for the US to not deny their immigration, but also not grant it either. So I grew up in San Francisco. So something we did often in school was take a little trip out to Angel Island, because you could just take a ferry and all their the immigration centers are still there. And you can see, right, these detention centers where people carved, poems onto the walls and recorded how long they were. And it's really a great tragedy of this era. So we'll explore this more, the difference between European and non-European and non-white people's experiences in immigration to the United States. Okay, that's all. Have a good day, and let me know if you have any questions.